The gravel road, long reclaimed by weeds and neglect, ended abruptly at a rusted, wrought-iron gate that sagged on a single hinge. A dirt track, barely discernible, snaked through a dense, overgrown forest of skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the perpetually gray sky. Reed cut the engine of his rented sedan, the sudden silence heavy and oppressive. He had driven for hours, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind, guided only by an outdated GPS and the terse instructions of a solicitor. This was the inheritance. A family home he'd never known, a place his parents had steadfastly refused to speak of, nestled deep within a wilderness that seemed to actively resist human presence. A strange mix of detachment and unease settled over him. He felt no connection to this forgotten patch of land, no ancestral pull. Yet, the air itself seemed to hum with a low, disquieting frequency, a vibration that resonated in his bones. He pushed open the gate, the shriek of metal echoing through the woods, and drove the final stretch. The house, when it finally emerged from the encroaching foliage, was less a home and more a monument to a forgotten purpose. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark, weathered stone and reinforced concrete, devoid of any aesthetic charm. Windows, many boarded or shattered, stared out like vacant eyes. It looked less like a residence and more like an abandoned bunker or, perhaps, an old research station, a detail the solicitor had mentioned in passing, dismissing it as an ancestor's eccentric hobby. The dilapidation was profound. Vines wrestled with the walls, moss furred every surface, and the roof sagged like a tired spine. Reed stepped out, the crisp, cold air biting at his exposed skin. The silence here was different from the road, deeper, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. He pulled a heavy, tarnished brass key from his pocket, the only thing salvaged from the solicitor's dusty office, and approached the massive oak front door. It groaned open with a sound like a dying beast, revealing an interior swallowed by shadows and the musty scent of decay. Someone's motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced the gloom. The main hall was vast, austere, lined with empty shelves and what looked like decommissioned control panels, their indicator lights long dead. This wasn't a family home in the traditional sense. It was indeed a research station, repurposed, perhaps, as a residence for its last reclusive occupant. He wandered through the silent rooms, each one a testament to some forgotten pursuit. A guard with cracked beakers and rusting instruments, observation rooms with one-way glass overlooking empty spaces, and living quarters that felt more like cells. He felt like an intruder in a tomb, an unwelcome guest in a place that held its secrets jealously. His exploration led him deeper into the structure, down a flight of concrete steps that spiraled into the earth. The cellar was colder, darker, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. Someone's shelves, laden with indistinguishable boxes and tarpaulin-draped shapes, lined the rough-hewn walls. He ran his hand along a particularly cold patch of stone, his fingers brushing against a loose section. Curiosity, a faint spark in the vast emptiness of his feeling, nudged him. He pressed harder, and a section of the wall, disguised by layers of dirt and grime, gave way slightly. A narrow, unlit passage beckoned. He retrieved a powerful flashlight from his car and returned, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The passage was short, terminating at a heavy iron-bound door, sealed with a series of rusted, complex latches. This wasn't a casual storage space. This was deliberate concealment. A grunt. Reed worked the latches, their mechanisms groaning in protest. The final one gave way with a resounding clang that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the station. He pulled the door open, revealing a chamber beyond. It was small, circular, and disturbingly devoid of light even with his powerful beam. In the center, resting on a pedestal carved from a single dark stone, was an altar. It wasn't an altar in the traditional sense, more an obsidian slab, angled and faceted in ways that defied simple geometry. A officer's surface was covered entirely in symbols, intricate and alien, etched deeply into the stone. As Reed's light played over them, they seemed to shift, to writhe, their lines and angles subtly altering, creating an illusion of impossible depth and movement. A morbid curiosity, cold and insistent, warred with an instinctual dread that screamed at him to turn and flee. The symbols pulsed with a silent, unseen energy, drawing him closer, their cryptic forms hinting at secrets no human mind was meant to comprehend. Reed found himself taking a step forward, then another, his flashlight beam fixed on the shifting, impossible glyphs, his breath catching in his throat. He had found something here, something far beyond a forgotten family home. The rusted gate groaned a final, mournful protest as Reed forced it open, the sound echoing in the unnerving silence of the late afternoon. The previous occupant, someone whose name now felt like a distant, irrelevant whisper, had left in a hurry, leaving behind only the barest essentials and an unspoken urgency that Reed hadn't fully grasped until now. He parked his own vehicle beside the derelict shed, its corrugated iron roof peeling like sunburnt skin. The main building, a sprawling two-story structure of dark, weathered stone, loomed before him, an institutional facade attempting to mask the decay beneath. This was the remote research station, his new home for the foreseeable future, where he was meant to compile the previous team's inconclusive data. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood or rust on a forgotten tool. The silence was not empty. It felt heavy, as if pressing down on his eardrums. He moved through the echoing halls, setting up his meager belongings in what appeared to be the main study, a large room dominated by a long oak table and shelves overflowing with forgotten yellowed reports. It began subtly, the way a chill creeps into a room. The first night. Lying in the uncomfortable cot, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like dry leaves skittering across a distant floor. He dismissed it as the old house settling, the wind finding purchase in loose panes. But it persisted, growing into a low, indistinct hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls around him. Not words, not yet, but a constant disembodied presence of sound, like a crowd whispering just beyond the threshold of hearing. He would press his ear to the cold stone, straining, but the moment he focused, it would recede, leaving only the oppressive silence. Someone came the shadows, fleeting dark blurs at the edge of his vision. A shape darting across the hallway when he turned his back, a flicker in the periphery of a window, gone the instant he looked directly. He'd spin around, heart thumping, only to find the empty space, the still air, the undisturbed dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. He told himself it was fatigue, the strain of isolation, the tricks his mind played in the absence of other stimuli. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was a persistent, chilling companion. The nightmares were the worst. They weren't fragmented or nonsensical. They were disturbingly vivid, filled with the stench of turned earth and something sweet and cloying. He dreamt of figures, gaunt and silent, moving through fields under a sickly, bruised moon, their hands reaching, not for crops, but for something unseen beneath the soil. He would wake abruptly, slick with cold sweat, the phantom sensation of mud clinging to his skin, and the whispers from the walls would seem to coalesce, almost forming words just outside his grasp. One night, he dreamt of a deep, resonant thrumming coming from beneath the station, a rhythm both ancient and hungry, and woke with a scream caught in his throat, his ears ringing. The unsettling phenomena spurred him to investigate. He wasn't just here for the data anymore. He needed answers. The previous team's reports were dense with geological surveys and environmental readings, but offered no explanation for the oppressive atmosphere. It was while searching for a misplaced diagram in a dusty cabinet in the study that he found it. A small, leather-bound book, tucked behind a stack of brittle maps. It was a diary, its pages browned with age, its ink faded but still legible. The opening entry was dated nearly a century ago, signed simply, Elias Vance. Reed recognized the name. Someone was one of the original landowners, someone of local folklore. He settled at the oak table, the whispers from the walls seeming to grow louder, more insistent, as he turned the fragile pages. Elias Vance's elegant script chronicled not scientific observations, but a descent into terror. August 14th, 1923. The land demands its due. His grandfather spoke of the pact, a desperate bargain struck when the blight took everything. They were starving. They offered a way out, but there is always a price. Reed's breath hitched. A pact. He read on, Elias's entries growing increasingly frantic, less coherent. September 3rd. The whispers begin. They know. The shadows move with purpose now. The harvest approaches. Not of grain, not of coin, but of sustenance. The land hungers. It remembers the agreement. The word harvest appeared again and again, always capitalized, always with an undercurrent of dread. Elias wrote of a recurring cycle, a debt paid in kind, and the soil's thirst. He mentioned the deep pulse beneath the old well, and the sacrifice to keep the blight at bay. There were cryptic references to the children of the soil, and a chilling entry that simply read, "It knows when to wake. It takes what is owed." As Reed absorbed the terrifying implications, the whispers in the room intensified, no longer just a murmur, but a cacophony of sound, like 1,000 insects buzzing behind the plaster. The shadows, previously fleeting, now seemed to solidify, stretching and twisting in the corners of his vision, coalescing into indistinct tall shapes that moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The air grew cold, a biting chill that made his teeth chatter. The thrumming from his nightmare returned, a low, guttural vibration that resonated through the floorboards, up into the table, and into his very bones. The research station, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just built on old land. It was built into it, a part of a sinister, active secret. The phenomena weren't residual, they were current. The whispers were no longer just background noise, they were a warning. The harvest was coming, and he was alone, caught in the middle of a debt long overdue. The previous days had blurred into a single, relentless current, carrying him deeper into the house's shadowed heart. The initial curiosity had curdled into something far more potent, a gnawing compulsion that scraped at the edges of his sanity. Someone had become a fleeting, unwelcome interruption, and food an afterthought. His world had shrunk to the confines of the ancient house, its dust-laden air and the relentless hum emanating from the artifact. It lay on a makeshift table in what he had designated his research station, a corner of the sprawling, dust-choked library. The artifact, a dark, strangely smooth stone, pulsed with a faint internal light, a subtle throb that resonated deep within Reed's own bones. It wasn't just in his mind. He could feel its presence, a constant low vibration beneath his skin, urging him, demanding his attention. He was no longer a visitor. He was an instrument, tuned to its silent call. The library was a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge, its towering shelves groaning under the weight of generations of accumulated lore. Someone motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grime-caked windows, illuminating a world of brittle pages and leather-bound secrets. Reed worked with a frantic energy, his fingers stained with ancient ink and grime. He devoured obscure occult texts, their cryptic symbols and archaic prose speaking of forbidden rituals and entities that dwelled beyond the veil of mundane understanding. He found references to the Guard Veil, a thin place between worlds, and Someone Stone, a conduit for unseen forces. The language was often maddeningly vague, but the underlying dread was palpable, a cold breath on his neck with every turning page. His research expanded beyond the occult. Someone with a laptop and a portable scanner, he scoured digitized archives, old microfiche records, and local historical society databases. He cross-referenced names, dates, and locations, meticulously piecing together the fragmented history of the region. The patterns emerged slowly, like shadows coalescing in the gloom. Local legends spoke of someone's sickness, periods when villagers simply disappeared, leaving no trace. Officer families, entire segments of the population, gone. The records, often incomplete or deliberately vague, consistently pointed towards the vicinity of the house, or periods shortly after its previous inhabitants had taken residence. There were hushed mentions of unnatural deaths, accidents too frequent, illnesses too sudden, always connected to the house's land or its occupants. The detective in him, though long dormant, recognized the signs of something deliberately obscured, a history whitewashed by fear. A detective came the genealogy. Someone the house's original deeds and a few old families, someone he'd unearthed in a locked chest. Reed began to construct his family tree. It was a tedious, painstaking task, but the deeper he delved, the more disturbing the gaps became. Some branches of the family simply ceased to exist, not through emigration or natural decline, but abrupt, unexplained terminations. Someone who never reached adulthood, spouses who vanished, lines that simply withered into nothingness. The dates often coincided with the local disappearances he'd been tracking. There were names listed as lost to the wilds, taken by the fever, or claimed by the river. But the sheer frequency and the chilling lack of further detail painted a far more sinister picture. He found multiple instances of the only survivor in various generations, individuals who inherited the house after a sudden, widespread family tragedy. And then, the symbol. It appeared first as a faint etching on the underside of a ceremonial dagger he'd found in a hidden compartment of the library desk. A stylized knot, not quite geometric, not quite organic, with a central void that seemed to pull at the light. He saw it again, subtly woven into the intricate pattern of an antique rug, barely discernible. It was etched into the spine of a particularly ancient leather-bound grimoire, almost hidden by the wear of centuries. Then, he found it painted on the inside lid of an ancestor's snuff box, and even more unsettlingly, crudely carved into the wooden frame of an old nursery rhyme book. It was an omnipresent whisper, a recurring motif that linked the artifact, his family, and the dark history of the house. It was a brand, a mark, and as he stared at the swirling design, he felt a sudden, profound certainty. This symbol was the entity's signature, a sign of its ownership, and he was staring directly into the heart of his family's long, inescapable curse. The realization settled over him like a shroud, cold and heavy, extinguishing the last flicker of his rational mind. He was no longer researching a mystery. He was excavating his own doom. The chill that seeped into his bones had nothing to do with the fading light, but everything to do with the oppressive stillness that clung to the research station like a shroud. He stepped onto the gravel path, each crunch underfoot seeming to shatter the fragile quiet, only for it to snap back into place with an unnerving speed. The main building loomed ahead, its windows like vacant eyes reflecting the bruised sky. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, a low, resonant groan rumbled through the structure, not the settling of old timber, but something deeper, more organic. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the station, a living, suffering sigh. Reed paused, his hands still on the cold brass handle, listening. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. He moved deeper, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor, and with each step, the building seemed to respond. The floorboards beneath him didn't just creak. They shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation that made his stomach clench. He walked down the main corridor, a familiar path now rendered alien. The walls, painted a clinical white, seemed to breathe, their surfaces subtly rippling, the lines of the paint almost blurring at the edges of his vision. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the effect persisted. Someone lengthened and deepened in impossible ways, clinging to corners and stretching across the ceiling like grasping tendrils. A cold, invisible draft brushed against his cheek, carrying with it a whisper that was no more than a phantom resonance in his ears, a wordless promise of malevolence. The distortions grew more pronounced. A framed map on the wall, one he'd studied countless times, suddenly showed unfamiliar landmasses, then snapped back to its correct form an instant later. He felt a disorienting lurch, as if the very ground beneath him had tilted, only to right itself with a sickening snap. His reflection in a darkened window stared back with eyes that seemed too wide, too hollow, a stranger in his own skin. A profound sense of dread, cold and absolute, settled over him, confirming the horrifying truth. Whatever had been lurking in the periphery of his awareness was no longer content to hide. It was here, now, overtly strong, twisting the very fabric of his reality. Someone began to claw at his throat. He needed to tell someone. Anyone. His hand went instinctively to his satellite phone. Its familiar weight, a small comfort. He tried Dr. Agard first, then his emergency contact at the regional office. The call wouldn't connect. Someone a busy signal, not even a deadline, but a strange, warbling static that seemed to mock his attempts. He tried again, and again, the frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The phone screen flickered, displaying garbled text before going dark entirely, unresponsive to his frantic presses. Next, he went to the communications room, the heart of the station's link to the outside world. The console, usually a beacon of flickering lights and data streams, was inert. He flipped switches, checked connections, but nothing. The main radio sputtered to life for a moment, spitting out bursts of white noise and fragmented voices, then died with a final, defeated hiss. He tried the emergency beacon, a last resort, but its indicator light remained stubbornly dark. His attempts to send an email were met with an endless loading screen, followed by an error message that simply read, "Connection terminated. Someone unknown." It wasn't just a technical malfunction. It felt like an active, malicious severing. The world outside had simply ceased to exist for him. The isolation pressed in, heavier than any physical weight. He was alone, utterly and completely, with whatever had taken root in this place. The groaning of the station intensified, a symphony of suffering wood and metal, punctuated by sharp, cracking sounds that echoed from unseen corners. The air grew colder, and the metallic tang sharpened, now tinged with something acrid, like ozone and dried blood. He could feel its presence. A tangible pressure against his skin, a malignant gaze that followed his every move, unseen but profoundly felt. Reed's sanity, already stretched thin by the preceding days, began its irreversible fraying. He found himself talking aloud, arguing with the empty rooms, pleading with the unseen entity. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He hadn't eaten in what felt like days, the thought of food sickening him. Someone was a forgotten luxury, chased away by the incessant creaks and whispers, the shifting walls and the terrifying certainty that something watched him from the gloom. He paced, sometimes for hours, from one end of the station to the other, checking doors that were already locked, staring into the distorted glass of windows that showed only his own terrified reflection. His mind raced. cycling through explanations, dismissing them, only to cling to them again in desperate hope. Was he hallucinating? Was it a breakdown? But the evidence of his senses, however warped, was too strong, too pervasive. He was trapped, utterly alone, in a research station that had become a living, malevolent entity, and the world had forgotten him. Someone it lay not a new, separate structure, but an older, forgotten wing of the research station itself. A skeletal annex that time and neglect had claimed. Someone motes danced in the sparse light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating cobweb-draped equipment and shelves laden with yellowed folders. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of decay and something else. Something ancient and stagnant. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on scattered debris. This wasn't just disused, it felt preserved, like a mausoleum for forgotten knowledge. A faded sign above a heavy oak door, half obscured by a hanging tarp, read, "Private Archive. Access restricted." The gate hadn't let him out, but deeper in. A shiver, colder than the room's temperature, traced its way down his spine. He pulled the tarp aside, revealing a lockbox and a keypad. Instinct, cold and sharp, told him to try the date of his birth. The light flashed green with a soft click. Inside, the archive was a labyrinth of towering shelves packed with leather-bound journals, scientific reports, and anachronistic-looking devices. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. Reed's fingers, trembling slightly, traced the spine of a journal bearing his family crest, a stylized serpentine knot. The first entry, dated over a century ago, was written in an ancestor's elegant, flowing hand. It spoke not of scientific discovery, but of the pact, the stewardship, and the cycles of awakening. He devoured pages, his mind racing to connect the disjointed fragments. There were detailed astronomical charts intertwined with intricate non-Euclidean geometries, anatomical drawings of creatures that defied terrestrial biology, and chillingly, genealogical records of his own family, annotated with cryptic symbols. He saw his great-grandfather's name, then his grandfather's, each followed by a symbol that grew increasingly dark and complex through the generations. He found mention of a great architect, an elder will, and a perpetual hunger. The horrifying truth began to coalesce, not as a theory, but as a suffocating certainty. A guard weren't mere researchers. They were custodians. The research station wasn't just a place of study. It was a cage, a temple, a feeding ground. His family hadn't been studying an anomaly. They had been serving it. The entity wasn't some distant, impersonal force. It was a malevolent, ancient intelligence intimately bound to their bloodline. Someone he found it. A final, thin journal, its cover blank, tucked beneath a stack of dusty ledgers. It was his father's handwriting, stark and desperate. The entries detailed a growing dread, a sense of the tightening noose, of the blood calling. And on the last half-finished page, scrawled with furious, almost illegible strokes, was a name. Reed. At that instant, the air in the archive turned heavy, viscous, like breathing liquid shadow. A silent, crushing pressure descended upon his mind, not a sound, but a profound presence. It wasn't just a psychic assault. It was an invasion, a flood of alien consciousness that bypassed his senses and tore through the carefully constructed walls of his sanity. Someone flashed before his inner eye. Vast cyclopean structures rising from an endless churning void. Grotesque forms of impossible geometry shifting in the cosmic dark. And at the heart of it all, a single, unblinking eye, ancient and cold, burning with an intelligence that dwarfed stars. He saw, understood, and felt the lineage. Someone just a family tree, but a chain. Each generation, a link forged in dread and sacrifice. His ancestors hadn't merely studied the entity. They had facilitated its existence on this plane, their lives dedicated to its arcane needs. They were conduits, feeding it, maintaining the fragile veil between worlds, and in doing so, ensuring its continued insidious influence. An officer had been willing sacrifices, others unwilling vessels, their minds and bodies consumed, twisted into grotesque mockeries of their former selves. And now, the weight of that chain was upon him. The symbols next to his ancestors' names weren't just annotations. They were marks of ownership, of a binding contract written in blood and fear. The entity's will, ancient and inexorable, resonated within his very bones. He wasn't just the next in line. He was the intended vessel. The final offering, the culmination of generations of carefully cultivated despair. A guttural cry, raw and animalistic, tore from Reed's throat, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He was trapped, not by walls or gates, but by his own ancestry, by a cosmic horror that had chosen him before he even drew breath. The truth was not merely horrifying. It was a living, breathing thing, crushing him beneath its unimaginable weight. His family hadn't protected him. They had delivered him, bound and ready, to an unspeakable fate. He was the sacrifice, and the entity was finally here to claim its due. Reed forced the rusted gate open, the mournful protest echoing in the unnerving silence of the late afternoon. He'd half expected to see the detective, perhaps a nervous wave, but the yard was empty, the air heavy and still. The research station loomed dark and silent, its windows like vacant eyes. A shiver, colder than the wind, traced its way down his spine. Not from the chill, but from the suffocating presence that now pressed in on him, no longer a distant dread, but a palpable weight. He stepped inside the main lab, the air thick with the scent of ozone and something else. Something ancient and metallic, like dried blood on old iron, clinging to the very fibers of the building. The fluorescent lights, already temperamental, flickered with frantic abandon, casting jumpy shadows that danced with malicious intent. The low hum of the few operational machines deepened, morphing into a guttural growl that reverberated not just in the room, but in the hollow of his chest. Surrender. The word wasn't spoken, but it bloomed in his mind, fully formed, undeniable. It wasn't his thought. It was an intrusion, a foreign seed planted deep, taking root with terrifying speed. He clutched his head, the sudden pressure behind his eyes a physical ache, as if his skull were being squeezed. The sterile white walls of the lab seemed to waver, the paint peeling back in his vision to reveal something dark and writhing beneath, like veins beneath skin. End the struggle. Someone, the fear. Someone of it. Now. The voice, if it could be called that, was a symphony of his deepest anxieties and his most secret desires, woven together into a single, insidious chord that resonated with the forgotten corners of his soul. He saw, not with his eyes, but with an inner vision so vivid it eclipsed reality, a vast, swirling vortex of knowledge. Every secret of existence, every hidden truth, laid bare. The mysteries of the universe, the very fabric of reality, waiting to be grasped. He saw himself, standing at its precipice, not a man, but something more, something transcendent, wielding power that could reshape worlds, twist fate, command the very elements. The offer was intoxicating, a balm to his exhausted spirit, promising an end to the ceaseless gnawing torment. No, he gasped, the word tasting like ash in his parched mouth. He stumbled back, bumping into a workbench, sending beakers and vials clattering. The sound was swallowed by the encroaching silence, a silence that hummed with malevolent energy, a hungry stillness. Imagine the peace. No more dread, no more uncertainty, only understanding, only control. You could be so much more than this fragile shell. The guard came the images, not as fleeting glimpses, but as an immersive, sickening reality. They flashed like lightning behind his eyelids, even when they were open, burning themselves onto his inner sight. He saw himself, but not him. His face was gaunt, eyes burning with an unnatural cold light, his hands stained with something dark and viscous, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. He was standing over a prone form, something broken and twisted beyond recognition, a grotesque shadow of what was once human. He felt a chilling sense of detachment, a cold, clinical satisfaction in the act, a perverse joy that clawed at his throat. The research station was a ruin around him, but it was his ruin, shaped by his corrupted will, a monument to his monstrous dominion. He saw himself commanding shadows, bending them to his whim, not just dark spots, but living, hungry things. He whispered words that shattered the minds of others, their screams unheard, their sanity ripped away by his casual cruelty. He saw the faces of the people he knew, his colleagues, their eyes wide with terror as he approached, not as Reed, the weary scientist, but as it, the entity's chosen vessel. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings, watching them dance to a macabre tune of his making, their fear a delicious offering. The acts were unspeakable, grotesque violations of humanity and nature. And the most terrifying part was the faint, lingering echo of a perverse pleasure within himself as he witnessed them. A horrifying resonance that made him question if this darkness had always been dormant within him. "Get out!" Reed screamed, his voice raw, hoarse, tearing at his throat. He slammed his fists against his temples, trying to dislodge the invading thoughts, the horrific visions, the seductive promises. His mind felt like a battlefield, two armies locked in a brutal, no-quarter fight, each blow a searing pain. He clawed at his own scalp, desperate to tear the images from his brain. Why resist? This is your true potential, your destiny. Someone it, and the pain ends. Forever. The promises were sweet, like poison-laced honey. The images of power, of absolute knowledge, of a terrifying absolute solace, were almost overwhelmingly seductive. He could feel the tendrils of darkness trying to root themselves in his deepest desires, promising an end to the ceaseless torment that had hounded him for days, for weeks, threatening to consume him entirely. He pressed his back against the cold, unyielding metal of a filing cabinet, sliding down to the floor, gasping for air. His breath hitched in his throat, ragged and uneven. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to remember. Some won the horrors, but the mundane. The feel of a pen in his hand, the scent of coffee brewing in the break room, the quiet satisfaction of a solved equation, the familiar creak of his desk chair. Anything at all to anchor himself to the man he was, not the monster the entity wanted him to become. He focused on the texture of the cold metal against his spine, the ache in his muscles, the sound of his own desperate breathing. Someone were his sensations, his reality. The entity recoiled slightly, a flicker of something akin to irritation, a sharp, cold jab in the psychic assault. The visions dimmed, the whispers softened, but they did not vanish. They merely receded, waiting, lurking at the edges of his consciousness, a patient predator. Reed opened his eyes, trembling. The lab was still dark, the lights still flickering, but the walls were solid again, the air merely stale, not reeking of ancient blood. He was drenched in sweat, his body shaking uncontrollably. But he was still himself. The battle was far from over. He knew that with chilling certainty. But for now, he had held the line. He had not surrendered. Reed stumbled through the rusted gate, the mournful protest of metal on metal echoing like a cry of despair in the unnerving silence of the late afternoon. The detective wasn't there. No one was. Someone the station, vast and oppressive, watched him with an unseen gaze. A sliver of his former self. A desperate, defiant spark ignited within his chest. Someone was no longer an option. The station wouldn't allow it. He had to sever its roots, to destroy the artifact, seal the chamber, or somehow, impossibly, break the ancient pact that bound this place to its malevolent occupant. He pushed deeper into the main research wing, a place once bustling with activity, now a mausoleum of forgotten ambition. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something cloying and ancient. He made for the lower levels, where the initial discovery had been made, where the artifact, he now understood, pulsed like a cancerous heart. The corridor ahead shimmered. One moment, it was a familiar path lined with defunct equipment. The next, it stretched into an impossible distance, the walls blurring into a sickening spiral. A guard tightened his throat, but he forced it down. Illusion. He clenched his jaw, focusing on the scuff marks on the floor, the only constant. As he walked, a whisper slithered into his mind, soft as a lover's breath, yet sharp as a razor. You failed them, Reed. Someone of them. Your research, your colleagues, your own mind. You brought this upon yourself. Someone flashed in his peripheral vision. Colleagues, their expressions twisted in accusation. Then his own face, hollowed and mad. He roared, a guttural sound that tore from his chest, and slammed his fists against the nearest wall, the physical pain a grounding anchor in the swirling chaos. The corridor snapped back into focus, shorter now, though the lingering scent of ozone and despair clung to the air. He pressed on. A door, one he knew led to the sub-level access, was now bricked over, rough, ancient stones mortared into place where steel should have been. It pulsed faintly, a dull red light seeping from the cracks. He touched it, and the stones felt impossibly cold, draining the heat from his fingers. The entity was actively working against him. He wasn't just walking through a building. He was navigating a living, malevolent organism. "No," Reed rasped, his voice hoarse. "You won't stop me." He pivoted, searching for another route, the emergency stairwell. He remembered it, rarely used, leading down to the deepest experimental labs. He found the door, its paint peeling, but it opened with a groan. Someone swallowed the stairwell, absolute and suffocating. As he descended, the steps beneath his feet shifted, some crumbling to dust, others elongating, forcing him to scramble, to leap over sudden gaps that hadn't been there moments before. The air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of him. A officer came the voices, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very stone. A detective just his failures, but the failures of everyone who had ever set foot in this station, an ancient chorus of regret and despair. Give in, Reed. Someone them. Be one with the silence. He saw fleeting images of himself, standing perfectly still, eyes vacant, part of the wall, part of the floor. The entity was trying to consume him, to make him another brick in its monstrous edifice. He reached a landing, his legs screaming, his lungs burning. Someone stood at the bottom of the stairs, cloaked in shadow. "Reed!" It was the detective's voice, calm, reassuring. "You don't have to do this. There's another way out. I'll help you." Hope, sharp and sudden, pierced through his fear. He started down, hand outstretched. But as he drew closer, the shadows began to writhe. The detective's face distorted, skin stretching, eyes blackening, a mocking rictus replacing the reassuring smile. A skeletal hand, impossibly long, reached for him. "Liar!" Reed screamed, recoiling, tumbling back up 2 steps. The illusion dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadow and static, the air crackling with malevolent energy. He pressed his back against the cold concrete, his heart hammering. It wanted him to give up, to choose the path of least resistance, the path of surrender. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his knees. This wasn't about escape anymore. It was about defiance. He had to reach the artifact, no matter the cost. He found another set of stairs, less grand, more utilitarian, leading further down into the station's forgotten depths. The descent became a gauntlet. Someone flickered, plunging him into absolute darkness, only to snap back on to reveal walls crawling with impossible shadows, or corridors that abruptly ended in sheer drops. He navigated by touch, by instinct, by the sheer, desperate force of his will. The floor beneath him occasionally vibrated, a low thrum that resonated in his bones, as if the entire structure was humming with a dark, sentient life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood before it. A massive circular door, unlike any other in the station. It was crafted from an unknown dark metal, etched with symbols that pulsed with a faint internal light, like veins beneath skin. This was it. The chamber. The heart of the ancient pact. The air here was thick, heavy, pressing down on him, whispering promises of power and oblivion. He could feel the artifact's malevolent pull through the solid metal, a siren song promising release or utter damnation. As he reached out to touch the cold, etched surface, the floor beneath him shuddered violently. A deep, resonant groan echoed from within the station's foundations. Someone spiderwebbed across the floor, then the walls, and a section of the ceiling directly above him began to crumble, raining dust and debris. The station was fighting back, unleashing its full, terrible power to protect its most sacred, most terrible secret. Reed looked up, shielding his head, realizing with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The entity would not surrender its prize easily. The rusted gate shrieked its mournful protest, a dying animal's cry that echoed into the oppressive silence of the research station. Reed pushed through, the metal scraping against the packed earth, and stepped onto ground that felt both ancient and utterly desolate. The buildings loomed before him, skeletal structures against the bruised twilight sky, their windows like vacant eyes staring into nothing. A cold, damp wind, smelling of decay and something sharper, metallic, snaked around his ankles. He found an entrance at last, a service door ajar, its paint peeling like diseased skin. Someone it. Darkness swallowed the light, a solid, tangible thing. He fumbled for the flashlight on his phone, its beam cutting a trembling path through the gloom. Someone motes danced in the light, thick as snow, revealing abandoned equipment shrouded in canvas, forgotten experiments decaying on scarred tables. The air was heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. A whisper, thin as old parchment, brushed past his ear. It wasn't a word, just a sibilant sigh that carried the weight of centuries. Reed spun, the phone light sweeping wildly. Nothing. A guard the shadows, deeper and more defined now, clinging to every corner. He pressed on, deeper into the station's heart, a sickening premonition tightening its grip on his gut. Then, they appeared. Someone all at once, but in flickers, like static on an old television. First, a movement in his peripheral vision, a tall, gaunt figure in clothing that belonged to a different era. A dark coat, a high collar. Someone another, a woman with eyes that burned with a cold, dead light, her hair a wild silver tangle. They were his ancestors. He knew it with a primal, sickening certainty. Their faces were stretched, distorted, as if seen through warped glass, but the features were undeniably those of his lineage. The same sharp jawline, the same set to the mouth, but corrupted, twisted into masks of malevolence. They were everywhere now, materializing from the shadows, surrounding him. Their forms were semi-transparent, shimmering like heat haze. yet they cast long, solid shadows that writhed and pulsed. A chill, more profound than any cold, seeped into his bones, a terror that bypassed thought and went straight for the marrow. He tried to move, to run, but his feet were rooted. A spectral hand, long and skeletal, reached out from the nearest figure. An old man with Reed's own nose, but his lips were sewn shut with dark thread. The hand passed through Reed's chest, and a jolt of ice-cold agony ripped through him. It was a violation, not just of his body, but of his very essence. As the hand withdrew, the world around him warped. The dusty research station dissolved, replaced by a flickering, cavernous space. Someone cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn stone walls. The air, thick with the scent of blood and something acrid, crackled with an unholy energy. Figures, solid and terrifyingly real, moved around a central stone altar. Their faces grim, their eyes burning with a fanatic devotion. They wore dark robes, their movements precise, ritualistic. He recognized them. The same faces, younger, less distorted, but already marked by the same unsettling zeal. His ancestors. He was no longer just an observer. He was there. He felt the rough fabric of a robe against his skin, the thrum of a chant resonating in his own chest. He saw through the eyes of one of them, his own hands, but not his own will, reaching for a ceremonial knife, its blade glinting with a dark, oily sheen. The chant intensified, a guttural drone that vibrated through the very air, calling to something vast and ancient and utterly monstrous. Officer images flashed, each more horrifying than the last. A circle of cloaked figures, their faces upturned, bathed in an unnatural, pulsating light that seemed to emanate from a void beyond the veil of reality. The glint of a blade, a choked scream, quickly swallowed by the rising chorus of voices. A dark, viscous substance pooling on the altar, reflecting the distorted faces of the celebrants. A profound, crushing sense of presence. Something immense and indifferent, waking, stirring, feeding. Reed gasped, his own breath catching in his throat, the scent of fresh blood filling his nostrils, even though he knew he was still in the abandoned research station. The past was bleeding into the present, the lines between his reality and their unspeakable acts blurring into a single terrifying truth. He could feel the desperate plea of the sacrifice, the cold, calculating resolve of his ancestors, the vast, hungry emptiness of the entity they served. He screamed, a raw, animal sound, tearing himself free from the spectral grip. The cavernous ritual chamber flickered, then vanished, replaced by the decaying lab. But the ancestors remained, their forms more solid now, their eyes fixed on him with a possessive hunger. They were no longer whispers. They were a legion, pressing in, their distorted faces inches from his, their cold breath raising goosebumps on his skin. "You are ours." A chorus of ancient, rasping voices whispered, each voice a different ancestor, yet all speaking as one. The blood remembers. The debt is due. He felt hands, countless spectral hands closing around him, not just on his arms and legs, but reaching into his mind, clawing at his sanity, trying to drag him back, to force him to witness, to become, the horror they had wrought. The station itself seemed to groan, the walls weeping with a dark, unseen moisture, the air growing colder, heavier, pregnant with the weight of centuries of sacrifice and devotion to something that should never have been awoken. Reed thrashed, a desperate, futile struggle against the relentless tide of his family's monstrous legacy, their eyes burning into his, promising an eternity of their unspeakable service. Reed pushed through, the metal scraping against his shoulder, a physical reminder of the barrier between the world he knew and the abyssal truth he now carried within him. He was a ghost, already. A wraith tethered to a purpose that promised only oblivion. His skin, once firm, now clung to his bones like stretched parchment, etched with a network of faint, pulsing lines that seemed to throb with an unnatural light beneath his pallor. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, burned with a feverish intensity, reflecting a resolve born of absolute despair. The air inside the station was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone, decay, and something else, a metallic tang that tasted like fear itself. This wasn't merely a dilapidated building. It was the entity's lung, its heart, the nexus where its tendrils had burrowed deepest into the fabric of this reality. Every shadow pulsed with a nascent malevolence, every creak of the decaying structure a whisper in a language not meant for human ears. The entity had not merely influenced Reed, it had inhabited him, leaving him a husk, a conduit. Yet paradoxically, this very corruption had granted him an understanding, a terrible intimacy with his tormentor. He knew its hunger, its methods, and, he hoped, its vulnerabilities. His plan, forged in the crucible of sleepless nights and waking nightmares, was less a strategy and more a self-immolation. He wouldn't fight the entity in a conventional sense. He would starve it, sever its connection by becoming the conduit himself, drawing its essence into his own being. And then he would break the vessel. It was a desperate gamble, a pact with annihilation. He knew it would cost him everything, his life, his sanity, perhaps even his soul, leaving nothing but an echo of the man he once was. But the alternative, allowing the entity to fully manifest, to spread its blight across the world, was unthinkable. He moved through the maze of laboratories, each room a tableau of sudden abandonment. Someone chairs, scattered papers, beakers still cloudy with petrified reagents. The equipment, once cutting edge, was now rusted, warped, or covered in a grotesque fungal growth that seemed to pulse faintly. In the main observation chamber, a console still hummed with a low, distorted thrum, its screens flickering with indecipherable symbols and static. This was the core, the place where the original experiments had pierced the veil, where the entity had first found purchase. A chill, deeper than any natural cold, seeped into his bones. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing in intensity, slithering into his mind like venomous serpents. They spoke of futility, of the sweetness of surrender, of the boundless agony that awaited him. He ignored them, focusing on the distorted hum of the console, the rhythmic thump, thump of his own failing heart. He'd brought nothing but a worn, leather-bound journal. Not his, but one found among the scattered remnants of the station's past, filled with arcane diagrams and half-mad scribblings that hinted at the entity's true nature. He knew the ritual wasn't about incantations or magic in the traditional sense, but about a focused act of will, a deliberate offering of self. The journal was merely a guide, a map to the internal landscape he needed to navigate. He reached the center of the observation chamber, where a circular platform, ringed by defunct energy conduits, pulsed faintly with an internal, sickly light. This was the anchor, the point of maximum connection. He climbed onto it, the cold metal biting at his bare hands. The whispers intensified, weaving themselves into a cacophony of shrieks and moans, tearing at the edges of his sanity. Someone's hands clawed at his skin, invisible tendrils brushed against his face, tasting his fear. He felt the entity's curiosity, its hunger, its ancient alien intelligence probing at his resolve. He opened the journal to a page marked with a dried, dark stain. It depicted someone, limbs splayed, connected by faint lines to a swirling vortex. A guarded, a single stark word: severance. Someone his eyes. Reed took a shuddering breath, the air tasting like ash and iron. He felt the insidious tendrils of the entity begin to bore deeper, seeking purchase within his very soul. His body began to convulse, a tremor that wasn't entirely fear, but the violent meeting of two disparate realities. He was the lock, and he was the key. "Come," he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible above the rising din. "Come and take your fill, but you will not take the world." Someone a supreme act of will, he reached within himself, not to fight, but to open. He became a gaping maw, a void, ready to consume or be consumed. A searing pain erupted in his chest, radiating outwards, as if his very essence was being torn from him, stretched thin across the chasm between worlds. He felt the entity rush into him, a cold, vast, and ancient intelligence, seeking to merge, to dominate. But he held fast, a fragile dam against an ocean of malevolence, determined to make his sacrifice complete. The battle for the world would be fought within the dying shell of Reed. Reed pushed through, the sound scraping against the raw edges of his nerves. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying the metallic tang of old blood and something else. Something acrid and deeply, fundamentally wrong, like ozone after a lightning strike, but infinitely more sinister. The main hall was a wreck. Someone lay overturned, their contents scattered across the grimy linoleum. Someone were smashed, their screen spiderwebbed with cracks, black eyes staring blankly. It wasn't the chaos of a struggle, but rather the sudden, violent abandonment of a place consumed by something it couldn't comprehend. No bodies. A guard, the chilling absence of them, as if the very air had swallowed the living whole. Reed's breath hitched, each inhale a painful rasp in his chest. He moved deeper, his footsteps crunching on broken glass and discarded papers. The silence pressed in, a physical weight that seemed to vibrate with a latent power. A hungry hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. He found the source of the oppressive feeling in what must have been the station's core. A large circular chamber devoid of scientific equipment. Here, the walls were bare, stained with a dark, viscous substance that seemed to ooze from the very concrete. In the center, a shallow, concave depression in the floor, filled with a shimmering, oily blackness that pulsed with an inner, terrible light. It wasn't a creature. It was a presence. A coalesced void, an absence of everything good and true, a hunger made manifest. It didn't have eyes, but Reed felt its awareness fix on him, a cold, probing tendril that burrowed into his skull, whispering thoughts that weren't his own, ancient and terrible. He saw flashes of impossible geometries, felt the crushing weight of aeons of malevolence. His mind recoiled, threatening to shatter. The thing they had sought, the thing they had inadvertently called. It offered him power, whispered promises of understanding, of transcending the frailties of flesh. It showed him visions of a world remade in its image, a landscape of perpetual twilight and silent, knowing dread. Reed knew what he had to do. He couldn't destroy it. No human could. But perhaps he could contain it. He extended his hand, not in an act of surrender, but of desperate, suicidal defiance. He focused every ounce of his will, every memory of light and warmth, every scrap of his own humanity, and he pushed. Someone at the entity, but into it. He sought to create a cage, not of steel, but of spirit, to become the final living lock. The blackness surged, roaring silently in his mind, a torrent of ice and fire. It ripped through his defenses, tearing at his sanity, trying to consume him whole. He felt his memories fraying, his identity dissolving, his very soul being flayed alive. He screamed, a sound that was only in his head, and pushed harder, pouring himself into the abyss, a desperate final sacrifice. A sickening lurch. A moment of absolute blinding cold, then a profound, echoing silence. The shimmering blackness in the depression flickered, then receded, shrinking, coalescing into a bead of pure, concentrated night. It didn't vanish, not entirely. It simply became still, dormant. Reed collapsed, gasping, his body racked with tremors. His skin felt like stretched parchment, his muscles like lead. He pushed himself up, slowly, agonizingly. The chamber was the same, yet profoundly different. The air was clearer, the oppressive hum gone. The stains on the wall seemed to have faded, or perhaps his eyes simply no longer registered them. He stumbled out of the research station, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The world outside felt alien, sharper, yet duller all at once. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. The wind whispered secrets he now understood, ancient and terrible. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Someone had changed within him. The profound cost had been paid. He was no longer just Reed. A coldness resided in his core, a vast, silent space where his soul had once been. He felt detached, distant from the world, yet intimately connected to its unseen currents of dread. The entity was contained, yes, but its essence, a fragment of its terrible knowledge, its chilling indifference, had taken root within him. He was a vessel, not its host, not its puppet, but its living prison, carrying its shadow, its silence, its patient, waiting hunger. He walked into the encroaching night, his silhouette long and gaunt against the dying light. The horror was not vanquished. It merely slumbered, a seed planted in fertile ground, awaiting its next harvest, its inevitable return. And Reed, the man who had dared to touch the void, was now its silent, unwitting harbinger.